You're listening to the Changing Normal podcast, where we strive to outdo the old normal and reject the new normal. And now your hosts, Owen, Dan, and Ben.
Hello and welcome to the Changing Normal podcast. This is episode 13, and this week we're going to, of course, talk about what we did this week. And in the crypto corner, we're going to discuss pseudonymous open ledger concepts. And is that important for the survival of Bitcoin? And then the main topic, we're going to go over the 12 principles of permaculture as laid out in Holmgren's writings. And we'll talk about how that can be applied to everyday life. And then, of course, some stories in the news. So Ben's not here with us this week. He's off, doing fun stuff, I guess, leaving us to slave away on this podcast.
He took up his axes and went away to battle.
So yeah, I'm sure he's missing it. But what did you do this week?
Let's see. I did a little bit more research on the cold room project I've been looking at. So I was trying to decide how much technology I wanted to insert and how much that might cost. So looking at things like...
What project?
Because, of course, the cold room project.
Oh, right.
Adding to my basement for food storage and so on.
Yeah.
So, of course, you can go with mostly passive design. And you have two vents, basically, one high and one low. And the idea is that hot air will exit and cold air will flow in passively if the external temperature is colder and you're needing a cooling effect, that is.
Yeah.
So I was looking at things like adding thermostats, wiring in either a fan or like a damper from the furnace heat source, different things like that. And some of those things are all pricey, like $100 minimum to get like a electronically controlled damper.
Well, that's the thing. If you want to sort of centralize all the control, that starts to get pricey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. A good way to sink a lot of money into it. So at this point, I might go with just the remote thermometer type units, thermometer, hygrometer combinations that feed back wirelessly to a central unit display panel.
Right.
So then you could put one outside. I could put one in the freezer, even if I wanted a freezer alert.
Mm-hmm.
And those are pricey too. Once you have the base unit and 3 or 4 remote units, but it would kill a few birds with one stone.
Yeah.
I was looking at a nice one. It was a little under $100, and it would give alerts for a minimum or maximum temperature that you set.
Right.
It can read out humidity as well. So I might go with that, and then a basic, shut it down if it's getting too cold, basically. So close your passive vent off by hand. So that requires more stepping in manually and keeping an eye on it. But
most of the time,
not worth it.
Well, most of the time, you're probably going to find that the shoulder seasons will be your biggest danger. But even that. So we have a cold room in the house. It's not like a root cellar. It's not humid enough to really store a lot of root vegetables and stuff. But it is insulated and not on the regular heating system, the heating zones. And I put in pipes through the wall to do exactly what you're talking about, so you can actually get we find that we might open that for a little bit in the fall when the temperatures start to cool.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, that room stays cold enough that we don't have to, it doesn't stay cold compared to the rest of the house. But it doesn't stay cold compared to outside, but compared to the rest of the house, it stays cooler all the way through till summer. Mm-hmm. And then by summer,
you're probably aiming
you're not
50 degrees Fahrenheit, I guess.
It was saying anywhere from
I was looking at a chart, and definitely depends on
11, 12 degrees. We could get it down to.
Okay.
In there, it's Celsius, so whatever that is Fahrenheit. But
okay, so you just control it manually then. We would. Or do you leave it open during the day as well in the fall days?
we
Just open it at night?
we would open it in like when it starts to get cooler. We'd open it and kind of cool that room down, so to speak, and then just plug it off, so we didn't have rodents and stuff coming in. And then that's it. We never bother it again until the next fall when we want to cool it down again a little bit. But we found just even having that on a separate heating system, like, or a separate heating zone, it just didn't heat up. And the fact that it was, you know, on an outside wall, it just naturally seems to stay cooler. So,
yep, I think that'll work, especially if you don't have to go down to look at thermometer and hygrometer type thing.
That's right.
So having the remote setup is probably the most valuable thing I can do for low cost.
Yeah, that's right.
So the other thing I have to do is
if you're trying to store like root vegetables and, you know, things like that, obviously you've got humidity you got to watch. So it's a little bit more. Yeah,
that was the next thing I was going to say. I was looking at the charts of, you know, what humidity is best for different vegetables, for example. And then it's like some don't want it as humid.
That's right.
So do you need like subzones within the cold room? Is it worth it dividing it a little bit, or do you just figure out which is the damper side and which is the drier one naturally, kind of thing? That's
right.
So things to play with.
Well, that's the thing, I mean, our house is so dry, and I don't have a basement, so I don't even have that option really. We store anything for root, like potatoes and carrots and all that. We store at my mom and dad's place because they've got that old farmhouse with the traditional dirt basement with the rock wall foundation, and that's what it was used for. And it's perfect. And you put stuff down there, and you don't do anything to it.
Yeah, naturally controlled humidity. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So if I was building again, I would definitely put in a root cellar, even if I wasn't doing a full basement. I would do the work to put in some sort of natural cold storage in a dirt basement somehow. But anyway, pretty hard to do now. And I'm not building another house just for that.
What have you been up to this week?
This week I haven't done a ton. I guess mostly been doing some planning. So looking at adding a little more fruit production to the property. Not doing it quite the way we've done it before, which is just basically trying to mix fruits in, you know, wherever in, you know, in my swales or in the orchard or different parts of the garden. I'm actually looking at maybe actually putting in rows of berry bushes, that sort of thing. Okay. You know, putting down the fabric and, you know, kind of doing the whole 9 yards, getting ready for next year, and then probably propagating off the plants I have now to fill out those rows over the course of a year or two. Because it's a pretty big financial commitment to just say, hey, I'm going to go buy, you know,
from a nursery,
100 of these and 100 of these and 100 of those. And, you know, that's a pretty big financial commitment. Yeah. Nice. Certainly nice if you can do it.
If you're talking berry bushes, they do tend to propagate fairly well from cuttings.
Yes, they do. And like we had a nice little harvest off of our 3 gooseberry, you know, plants this year. And so that was pretty cool. That was the first year we've actually had a real nice, you know, bunch of berries off those. So that would be one of the things we'd probably put in. And of course, blueberries are always a favorite, and some more haskaps and things like that. So,
looking back at my experiments with berry bushes so far, I think the thing I would definitely do is like lay out my compost, lay out the fabric a year before I wanted to plant. And it's definitely worth so much to have your grass and weeds killed off and then have that surface, you know, nice and ready to plant in.
So that's the kind of thing we're planning. We're going, okay, if we're going to do this, we'll start it next year and we'll do the prep this year of putting everything down, laying out the fabric and kind of getting everything ready. So now it's just kind of planning, where do I want to put it? Do I want to put it, beside the orchard? Do I want, that's my nicest field that I have. And I don't know if I really want to take that space up because it would make awful nice pasture. And I usually run the chickens on it, but I should be running the chickens in the lower field. So it's kind of one of those things I got to walk it and see what's going to be the best thing to do. The other thing is heating. So I heat my house. We have a wood stove, but we primarily heat our house with waste oil. Well, waste oil in a like a hot water boiler, but the waste oil is getting harder and harder to find. And I have so far this year got one tote of oil, and I need like 6 to get through the winter.
Ooh.
And I don't want to heat all winter with a wood stove. So I'm kind of looking at the situation going, I'm going to try to get oil, but if I don't, what's my backup plan? And so I've sort of identified that as a bit of a weakness in the house or on the property. We have the wood stove as backup, but it's not a convenient backup. And so I'm looking at the potential to put in a some sort of wood-fired water heating system. And I'm potentially looking at building it for myself from scratch.
Okay. So you could incorporate some like high efficiency design elements.
High efficiency design elements, but even just the cost effectiveness. If you look at what a boiler is, it really is not complicated.
No.
And I have got the skills to build, to do all the welding and pour all the concrete and things like that. So just from a cost savings, it would be significant. So anyway, there's not 100% decided on that, if that's what I'm going to do, but that's kind of over the next few weeks or month, I'm going to have to get serious about it and figure out what I'm going to do. And then the final thing is basically getting a source of sugar on the property. We don't have maple trees. So I was kind of thinking, well, we want to have some kind of source on the property for that. So really my only other option is honey. So I'm looking at probably trying to get some bees for next year.
Okay, cool.
Get them next year, not get them now for next year. Obviously, it's a little bit late in the year to be starting that. But again, this is all planning stuff, trying to identify, where do we have holes in our resiliency, and what's going to be the best way to plug that hole. So that's kind of probably where we're going with that. If I had maple trees, then I'd probably go with the maple syrup route, but I don't. So then cedar and spruce syrup isn't very good.
Rub a little spruce pitch on your pancakes in the morning. That'll do the trick.
That'll keep you from eating anything the rest of the day. Oh dear. Okay. So yeah, crypto. Let's move on to that. So yeah, we had this idea maybe to talk a little bit about. You could frame this a couple different ways. You could frame it as they can track everything, man. You can't hide. I don't want to get in crypto because I can't hide. So that's
you kind of got to look at that feature of Bitcoin where it is an open ledger, and part of that is it doesn't have your name on it, but it has a variety of addresses on it, and if those addresses can be linked to your name through a corporation, for example, an exchange that has both, you can start piecing clues together. It's like, oh, this person has this address. It's like this, this person has been sending from the exchange to this address. That's probably their personal wallet type thing. And so you can kind of start tracking down, and it's not fully anonymous in that sense. So like we mentioned the word pseudo-anonymous.
Yeah,
And
that's
kind
right.
of key to understand what that means.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like Satoshi kind of, if you go back to the beginning, Satoshi kind of insinuated that you have to sacrifice privacy for security. And if you're going to have the system of mining and nodes and confirmations of transactions, and everybody has to be able to read the whole ledger. I mean, that's what makes Bitcoin work, really. And so in order to do that, you have, with the technology that was available at the time, you had to sacrifice privacy in that sense. Now, what you do see, though, is it pseudonymous in that at that time, I don't think Satoshi saw the whole concept of an exchange being as popular and the primary method by which you get Bitcoin. I think he really saw mining as being the way people would get Bitcoin. And that's quite anonymous because there is no link to KYC or any of that sort of stuff where your actual public identity is known. And so that way, those Bitcoin are anonymous. I mean, if you mine it, it can be as anonymous as your security is for your mining. Right. So
yeah,
I don't think
definitely the case that there weren't concerns about anonymity in the beginning as much, because pseudonymous, when you're starting with kind of a clean slate, is very close to anonymous. It's only now where you have so many the KYC, the know your customer laws, people are doing so much of the transaction routing through exchanges and so on, where they've verified their identity with a government ID. So it's only after that it's become a bit of an issue. But I think looking back at the problem they were trying to solve, though, is the issue of being able to make money for nothing, being able to create value without outputting any work. And that's what banks were doing, with fractional reserve banking, with loaning money that they didn't even have.
Still are.
And so having the open ledger was one of the key features to creating a sound money, defeating the easy money, the printing of money, what we call printing, which isn't actually printing of money,
right? Yeah.
Creation of value. But then we kind of get into, is the open ledger necessary? Can we add in some anonymity without destroying what the open ledger gives us? So I guess there's some different thoughts on that. I mean, there's coin mixing, which is basically we're going to dump everything into a pool and shuffle. It's like shuffling a deck of cards, and then it's like, okay, now decide who had which card now, after everybody threw their cards into the middle of the table and shuffled them, and you hand people out the number that they had before. You get the same amount of Bitcoin, but you've basically twisted and tangled the history to where you can't, there's no value in tracking it, even though you can see where each Bitcoin, like which address the Bitcoin was tied to it at each point in time. There's no value if it's been through the coin mixing as far as traceability. Like you can't be sure who had it.
Yeah.
Or
because one of the main arguments and concerns about the lack of anonymity is, of course, some people make the argument, well, if this is a blacklisted coin, you could unknowingly acquire a blacklisted coin and then basically get banned from ever being able to monetize that in any way. Because that stuff is trackable, in the sense that if an address is flagged,
we could explain what blacklisting is. I guess that could be like, okay, so you steal my phone and I didn't have a password on my software wallet, and you move my Bitcoin over to your address, and I look up on the open ledger and I say my Bitcoin went from this address, which was mine, to here. And then I report you and say, okay, my Bitcoin is over here. It's not supposed to be. And because of the decentralized nature of Bitcoin, nobody can get it back.
That's right.
There's no authority that can, return those funds, but we could all identify the address as one that has stolen funds.
That's
so
right.
If everybody that transacts, especially the exchanges, have that address on a blacklist, basically a do not trade with or freeze if it comes into your possession type thing.
Yeah.
And if you tried to send that to an exchange, like trade it out into a stable coin or into a privacy coin, then they might seize it as soon as it passes into their custody.
Mm-hmm. And one of the actual bigger risks is the way that the addresses work. So if you send me half a Bitcoin, but I need to send 3/4 of a Bitcoin, I'm good. The wallet or the transaction is going to seem automatic for me, but it's going to take your half a Bitcoin and it's going to take a partial amount of another address. You know what I mean? And lump them together and send them. And so you're getting these fractional bits. And so you can actually contaminate other Bitcoin with blacklisted Bitcoin. If you know does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep. Basically, you're getting public addresses can be tied together on a sent transaction, basically.
Right.
So then you can see that they're almost certainly paired back to the same private key. Whereas before, because you can generate multiple public addresses from one private key, you'd think that provides you more anonymity. But like you said, there's a mechanism in the transaction function where those addresses can get paired together. That was an interesting thing to read about, actually.
Yeah. So anyway, all that is to say, that's one of the concerns with the quote unquote lack of privacy in Bitcoin.
But Lightning does solve a lot of the issues in that because it's second layer, it's off the main chain. And so it's hard to track it in the Lightning channel. And then when it comes back on, you don't really know how many times it may have passed from one hand to another. There's no provable trace line, I guess.
Yeah, basically you really can only identify the beginning and the end of it.
Of a Lightning channel. Yeah.
Yeah. And even if you really delve into it, and I'm not like an expert on the Lightning network and how exactly it all works, but I think even that you can only identify where it ends. Isn't that the case? Like a third party looking in, maybe. Anyway,
Sure,
I better not.
That one.
Yeah, I listened to a whole podcast on it, and a lot of it was over my head because what they were discussing and talking about. But yeah, you're right. It does definitely add an amount of anonymity and a certain amount of security. And I'm wondering if that maybe in the future will be the primary way in which we get anonymous Bitcoin is through the second layer solutions. The on-chain stuff will always be the way it is, where you can't anonymize the on-chain transactions, but you can get that anonymity through the Lightning Network, for example. And that will continue to increase, and so you'll, Yeah.
You mentioned the criticism that being able to tie history to Bitcoin movements as it passes from hand to hand basically makes Bitcoin less fungible, which I found to be an interesting argument. Fungibility is basically meaning that every piece is equal. So it's like, this is a Bitcoin, that's a Bitcoin. This is, they're equal. This is, 100 Satoshis. You have another 100 Satoshis. They're completely equal. That's that's what total fungibility is. So if you have a history, does that make my 100 Satoshis different from your 100 Satoshis?
Well,
maybe.
It
seems like a stretch, but
Well, yeah, this is the thing. I think there's different understandings of the definition of fungible, and I've had this debate with people, and I think Bitcoin is fungible in that it all can be exchanged for each other. No Bitcoin, no two Bitcoin are apples and oranges, so to speak, right? So in that, if I send you a Bitcoin, it's worth what the market says it's worth, just the same as if of any other Bitcoin. To me, that's fungibility. But in a sense, they are unique, and it's almost like cash that has been serialized in that sense. A $20 bill is worth a $20 bill, the same as every other $20 bill. But there is certain unique properties about each one that makes it unique. That's just the fact that it has a history, where it's come from, what it's been used for, what addresses it's passed through.
Yeah, not that you can see in the ledger what it's been used for,
That's
but
right.
you can see every address it has been associated with, basically. So from the moment it was mined,
what it's been used for is only attached to it if someone goes back through and does that chain analysis, and it starts tying it to real world people or places or events.
Yeah, that does require more real world data collection from other sources, though.
Oh, for sure.
That's not in the blockchain. So.
And it's quite expensive to do because it's very difficult, because it's not as easy as pulling up the blockchain and going, oh, well, Dan did this and sent it here, and Bob picked it up from there, and and you can't follow it like that.
So I guess to sum it up, we can say that just the fact that the situation is uncertain kind of incentivizes developing second layer solutions that basically make that history of any piece of Bitcoin irrelevant, because it's been batched with transactions on a Lightning channel, or it's been through a coin mix process or something like that. Something to free it up from any reliable traceability.
Yeah. And I think two things. For me, there's two things that I would take away from this to sum up. One is use good digital hygiene with your Bitcoin, if I can frame it that way. Yeah, you may have to use an exchange to get it, but be smart about, using multiple public addresses when you receive it, putting it on a device that maybe isn't directly associated easily with you, from a just for security reasons, right? Because the anonymity of it adds security. Like, that's really what we're talking about. It. Why is anonymity important? Well, because it gives security to holding it. If someone hacks, a company that sells Bitcoin wallets, and they find out, Bob at 123 Maple Street, bought a hardware wallet. Now I'm going to go to his house, so using the best anonymity tools you can, as far as how you store it, how you receive it, and things like that. I think that's important, because it's adding to the security, and that's what really the anonymity gives, is security. The other thing is, let's say, because it sounds like we're really criticizing Bitcoin. I mean, the last 10 minutes or so here, really slamming on Bitcoin and how it's not anonymous, so therefore that's bad. It's a bad thing. If every single piece of Bitcoin could be tracked and directly associated to a person, at the end of the day, 21 million. At the end of the day, the Bitcoin protocol remains unchanged. The hard cap remains unchanged. However much anybody has is irrelevant to what Bitcoin brings to the table as sound money, as hard money, and what that does for economies and countries and savings and people's lives. That doesn't change whether Bitcoin's anonymous or not.
Absolutely.
So to me, that's the biggest thing that I go, yeah, it's maybe not perfectly anonymous, but that doesn't really matter in some respects.
Yep. And if there's demand for it, the developers will find a solution. We've seen
Exactly.
the beta versions of different solutions, and hopefully we'll see some that are both, user friendly and bulletproof. So
That's right.
it'll be
That's
exciting
right.
to see that stuff coming down the road.
All right. So, permaculture. We're going to jump back to permaculture. We did a kind of a general permaculture show a few weeks ago.
Yeah, we hit on the 3 ethics, right?
Yeah, some of the different ethics, the 3 ethics, the prime directive, and you had a good PDF by David Holmgren, and it lays out sort of the 12 his 12 principles of permaculture. So this is taking permaculture principles. Well, you could either say he's taking, Mollison's book and trying to distill it down to, all of those principles down to 12 principles. Or maybe he's taking the prime directive and the 3 ethics and expanding it to 12 principles. I'm not sure which which direction, of course,
the ethics
going.
are so broad, it doesn't really direct your actions necessarily. True. So I think this is just building on that to give you an idea, point you in the right direction as you kind of launch into applying them. So
yeah, okay.
12 is a good number. It's not so long that it's impossible to get through, but covers the bases.
So yeah, we'll try to run through these. We won't spend a ridiculous amount of time on them, hopefully, because honestly, you could almost do a show on every single one of these separately. But why don't you run through them? Do you want to run through them all in?
Let's just do them one at a time.
Okay.
So number 1 is observe and interact. And definitely, that's a big part of doing design for stuff. Like you mentioned, putting in berry bushes. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're going to observe, what piece of land would work for it. Something interesting with the interact bit I read the other day was someone said when you buy a piece of land, you might interact with people who have lived on it previously and have some historical knowledge. And I was like, that was an interesting way. I hadn't thought of applying interact in that way before. I'd thought of it more like interacting by like getting out on the land, if in different seasons and different weathers, and how that would help you observe more things. But interact can be applied a lot more broadly than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And to apply this broader, because we want to apply all of these principles, not just to growing something. So the people that are listening who think we're only talking about gardening, we're not. You can use the principle of observe and interact in your everyday life. You can apply it to, security, observing and interacting with the environment you find yourself in, whether you're in a city or on a bus or whatever. You can apply it to the people around you, your relationships. You observe that your wife's kind of mad at you and you need to interact with her to figure out why, or whatever.
Sometimes failing to observe can costly.
That's right. So
I think it's something I've thought of differently. I remember a Sherlock Holmes story, actually, where Sherlock asks Watson how many steps lead to their flat or apartment, whatever it was.
Okay.
And Watson had no idea. And he's like, how many times have you ran up those steps and never observed? So it's like, how many things are there in daily life that you've kind of programmed your mind to not use any space on actually observing? It just flies by and you don't actually see it in a way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So the second one is catch and store energy.
That's a good one.
This one, I love all of these, but this one is pretty neat because it can be used in so many different ways.
So
the
basically, Well, I mean, we rely on energy sources of various types. I mean, you mentioned heating, so like even stacking up firewood, that would be storing energy.
Hmm.
Um, I think in the growing space, obviously, it's how much sunlight you can capture in your plants.
Or
That's a
water
big
you
deal, of
can,
course.
or water you can keep
Yeah,
on your
stored
property.
water. Yeah, especially in a drought. I mean, we're fortunate to not deal with that where we live, but
Hmm.
in so many places, I mean, a lot of the south and up through to like from Texas to Colorado, I've been looking at the ongoing drought this year,
Hmm.
and those places are ones where people who have taken the effort to design in some capturing of energy in water form in particular, that has such value.
Yeah.
Um, and so that I've seen that done in different scales. I mean, people set up rainfall catchments. You can actually collect a ton of water off of most roofs based on their surface area.
Hmm.
Um, Ponds in strategic locations, things like that. How'd that apply if you weren't growing anything as far as catching and storing energy? Well, storing food is one way of storing valuable energy.
Hmm. Yep, for sure. And I mean, I guess depends on how metaphysical or ethereal you want to get with it. But there is the concept of catching and storing energy in how you take care of your body, making
Hmm.
sure that you maintain some sort of physical fitness, and that's in a sense storing energy. Um, so you don't tire out in 2 seconds when you go to run up a hill or something. Um, there's the
Hmm.
concept of emotional energy or things like that. Um,
Yeah, that's a good one. Because I mean, there's a division there as far as extroversion versus introversion as well.
for sure,
And
for
so
sure.
managing that is one type of storing energy.
That's right. And it's making sure you take time to recharge yourself so that you're, not burnt out all the time.
Hmm.
So
So all of these really can apply to lifestyle design
that's right.
and kind of really specific pieces of it.
Which really I think is the general takeaway from permaculture is that you can utilize it as as lifestyle design principles
Hmm.
beyond. I mean,
Yep.
like we've already said, you most often see it applied to agricultural or growing type applications, but it really is much broader than that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, and we can recognize that it applies to broader areas of life while also saying, well,
Hmm.
when it comes right down to it, the essentials of life,
That's
shelter,
right.
water, food.
Exactly. Exactly.
Number 3 is obtain a yield. You'd think that one would be obvious, but then, I mean, it's very easy. I mean, I can speak for myself here to engage in things that aren't profitable in any way. And things should
Hmm.
be, um, ideally anyway, uh, they would obtain a yield for you, or perhaps you're doing it for someone else. But if your actions are set up so that you're not, that's probably something you need to consider and apply a little design work to. Because whether that's like my personal relationships, they should be beneficial, and that is a type of yield.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you can grow flowers because it makes you happy, and that's
Hmm.
great. That is a type of yield.
Hmm.
But if
Yeah.
you're really happy and starved to death because you didn't grow any vegetables,
Well, there's the.
so you do have to be practical in your yield so that it, is your yield needs to be a practical yield as well. To just say, you know,
Well, at the end of the day, if you're starving, you're not going to be happy, are you? So
well, you would
then
think.
it stops giving you a yield. But basically, it's designing different things house design is an interesting one to think about. Does the way your house and your like backyard is designed, does that make you happy, or are you desperate to get that vacation time and go to a different spot?
Yeah.
Does your house make you unhappy?
That's right.
Different things, workplaces, schools, public areas, they could all be designed in ways that maximize yield.
Yeah.
Which is often maximizing the usage, maximizing the items you can produce, whether that's food or whether that's the produce of your work, and definitely maximizing enjoyment as well.
Yeah. Yep. And I think on the other side, to look at something and, you can look at a plant and say, well, this plant does not produce anything. So it needs to be fixed or eliminated from my system because it's not giving me a yield. So if there are those things that are not giving you any yield at all, then the next one really applies.
Well, I was going to say, I thought of one more example for this.
Okay. Yeah.
And I don't know how many times I've looked at the white pines that ring my lot and thought, man, I wish those had been planted as like Korean stone pine or Swiss stone pine.
Yeah.
So it could be almost the exact same tree, but have an additional functionality.
Yep.
And then the other thing I saw was Bill Mollison. There's a really interesting quote. He said, the yield of a system is theoretically unlimited or limited only by the information and imagination of the designer.
Yep.
I was like, wow. Thinking of that, because we too often maybe don't look at ways that we could alter the design a little bit. But then on a practical side, there is the principle of limited returns, I think it's called, where you can, it costs exponentially more to get decreasing gains in a yield. So I think you do have to apply that practical factor.
That's
but
right.
I think he wanted to make people think about just how much more systems can produce with more design thought put into them. And I think that's why he said limited only by the information and imagination of the designer. Simply that there are so many different ways to stack different plants, for example, with different functions in a space. One cool thing that you can see on the internet is the way people stack functionality of furniture, say in a tiny home. They have things that collapse. They've had a higher level of design applied to each item, basically.
Right. So that it does multiple things. And that's a permaculture principle as well, that every part or piece of your design should do multiple things. And that's not, I don't think that's not specifically one of Holmgren's principles, but that is a design principle. I'm trying to find something. Here it is.
You go back to the book?
I've gone back to the book. So this is out of the Permaculture Designer's Manual. This concept, what you just talked about, was my eyes were open to that when and Mollison uses the example of a chicken in his book. You might be familiar with this. I don't know. So there's he's just got this diagram in the book. It's got a picture of a chicken, and then it has needs on one side, intrinsic characteristics on another side, and then products and behaviors at the top. So when we start thinking about pieces in our design, and you one of the things you need to do is break down and diagram every single thing about that. Because what we think of chickens, meat and eggs, right? Meat and eggs. That's what chickens are for.
Production. Yeah.
You can either eat the eggs or eat the chicken. So ignoring like the needs and the intrinsic characteristics, just the products and behaviors: eggs, meat, feathers, manure, methane, CO2, scratching, foraging, flying, fighting. So we had meat and eggs, and there's 7 or 8 other things that are either products or behaviors that could be utilized to obtain a stacking yield in some sort of a system.
The animal behavior one I've always found particularly fascinating.
Yeah. So that's just an example there of how, an example of the yield that's obtainable being almost unlimited. Just because there's so many things that you don't necessarily think of that if you diagrammed it all out, chicken's pretty amazing when you start diagramming it all out. Anyway, I hope that that's what pops in my mind on that.
All right, let's jump to 4.
Apply
self-regulation
and accept feedback.
Oh, bummer. I have to do that too. What if I don't like feedback, Owen?
Well, this is interesting because this is probably the 2 things that humans struggle with the most. Right? So far, it's all about other stuff. Now, all of a sudden, it is you need to be self-regulated and you need to accept feedback about what you've done.
Why self-regulation? That sounds like taking personal responsibility.
Right. Or showing self-control.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely don't feel that should be applied by central planners. I want people to be applying this to themselves individually.
Exactly.
To the things they're personally responsible for. I guess part of that is some systems are self-maintaining through their feedback loops, I guess you could say.
Yeah, for sure. This one, I think some of these other ones do too, but so far, this one really is the one that applies to people specifically. I think, if we think of permaculture as a design science, then, and if this is a principle of a design science, then we need to be self-regulating in our actions, and our consumption probably also applies quite specifically to that. And accept feedback. Now, that feedback might be from other people, or that feedback might be from that chicken. If we go out and our chicken's dead, maybe we shouldn't just throw more chickens in there to the same environment, right?
That wouldn't be accepting the feedback.
That's right.
Accepting the feedback would be adjusting the design in some way or modifying your behavior in some way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So
definitely a valuable one.
Yeah. So number 5, produce no waste. The environmentalists love this one.
Produce no waste at all. Is that 5 or 6?
I
see.
That's 5 on my list.
I had it at number 5, didn't I?
Yeah.
Produce no waste.
So does that mean like no garbage bags allowed?
Man, I mean, definitely you go to single-use plastics immediately, I would have to say. And it's like, that's definitely a waste stream that's providing, even though they claim they can recycle some of it, most of it's not getting recycled. And the products are not particularly desired that are made with recycled plastic. They tend to be lower quality so far, or else prohibitively expensive without subsidizing it. So what do you do with that? I think Mollison probably lived a life without many single-use plastics. That's quite a jump, though. If I think of things, just like bagging chickens that we grow on our own farm, it's like, how would you do that without plastic? That would be
unsanitary.
Be quite a problem to overcome. I mean, plastics provide us with that higher level of sanitization. It's fairly cheap for the job it does. it provides a lot of value. So then my mind goes to, can we convert that from useless waste into something that is more valuable?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's, rather than eliminating all plastics, maybe we should go into the design of using that waste in a way that isn't prohibitively expensive, in a way that isn't, totally not cost effective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's just one example of examining a common waste product in people's homes. This also could be applied to a garden where, well, I've picked enough beans for my winter's needs, so the rest just sit there and rot into the ground. So don't you think that maybe that also would be a way where you'd say produce no waste, in that you don't waste that crop. You utilize the rest of that crop. You feed it to the pigs. You compost it. You follow the third ethic of return of surplus, and you convert that surplus to be a functional part of your system, either on the property or perhaps you give it away. You help those in need with it so that there is no waste generated from that. So that's another way of looking at that as well.
I think the biggest example that comes to my mind is how manure is handled in particularly in large operations. I mean, the concrete sludge pit has been one of the big parts of design elements for huge commercial operations, and applying that manure as a slurry onto fields. And it's really one that doesn't, I guess it is one that is producing a waste and then trying to dump it anywhere possible, rather than recognizing how valuable that supposed waste could be if handled a little bit differently.
That's right.
Instead of putting so much water into it and ending up with a slurry pit, what if you kept it drier and combined it with a carbon source like sawdust or straw, and make compost with it that is much more stable, that's not going to be wasted, that's not going to put nitrous oxide and ammonia into the atmosphere. It's going to put all that value back into the soil.
And that's really you're talking there about just a change of mentality, a change of how you approach what you produce or the byproducts that are produced, from what you're doing. And like you say, most people look at that and go, well, that's just waste. That's just extra. I have a brewery and I use my, the grains to make the beer that I sell, and then we just throw the grains out because that's just a waste product.
Just dump it in a big pile.
Exactly. So if you can utilize that, you're then fulfilling this principle of producing no waste. The waste is actually being utilized for something productive. So,
yep.
And this somewhat ties into the next one, which is use renewable resources and services. We think of renewable as being green, like solar and wind power and things like that. That's the renewable. That word has been sort of what's it? It's kind of like one of those catchphrases or keywords that you hear in the media a lot. Oh, that's renewable energy, right? But that's not necessarily what this is talking about.
Keyword marketing, basically.
Exactly.
More than an appropriate label usually.
Yeah.
Renewable is a little bit hard because, I mean, you could say mining is not renewable, but if mining allows you to establish a system that can continue forward without those mined resources, isn't that valuable enough to do things like mining for the benefit, basically for how you can leverage it? So that's something I think there's room for debate on, but definitely valuing the renewable resources. So like instead of simply cutting all your trees, planting it back again or managing it away so it naturally regrows, so that you have continued yield and not just a one-off yield.
That's right. Yep. So going to the next one, design from pattern to detail.
Mollison was really big on patterns in his book.
Oh, yeah.
Holmgren is the same way.
It's a big part of permaculture, because permaculture is taking a lot of principles from nature. And certainly when it applies it to growing things, there's a very large facet of it that is drawing on the way nature naturally does thing in a forest, for example, with layers and different, plants of all different sizes working together. There's a pattern there. Doesn't necessarily, it may seem very random when you look at it, but the pattern sometimes is these plants grow in this kind of soil or this kind of environment, or, that's the pattern.
I think that can be applied in different ways. I mean, when I think of like designing your backyard or even a larger property, permaculture uses the concept of zoning, and that's kind of one of the biggest overall patterns that you apply. You kind of mark out your zone 1. I think, is that the house or what is immediately outside of your house?
I've seen it both ways.
Outside.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm combine the two. So it's basically what you're walking across probably every day, more often than not. So your living space and perhaps what's immediately adjacent to it. And then zone 2, is just a little further away, and you go all the way to zone 5 is the furthest out. You're probably not seeing it very often.
Yeah, if ever.
So like the back corner, or
that's right.
Maybe that patch of woods that you walk across once a year.
Yeah.
So recognizing those bigger patterns, because that affects how you'll want to fill in those things. In interactions with people, I think, what do they call it? Circle of influence. Circle of what is it? Circle of control is what's closest to you.
And the circle of concern is the one that's further,
furthest one away. So recognizing those patterns then helps you apply different details more usefully, I would say. You can say like, oh, this is something that is in my circle of concern. I should be maximizing what I do with it. Did I say that right? Circle of concern or circle of control. If it's within my circle of control, I should be maximizing what I personally do with it, how much I think about it. If it's circle of concern, the furthest area away from me in my life, my ability to affect it, I shouldn't be applying much of my thinking to it, because I can't then act on that and obtain a result.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
Recognizing the pattern and then sorting things out helps me actually act in a more useful way.
And I think it's important the way this is written, design from pattern to detail. It's not designed from detail to pattern. So the concept is, look at the macro view, create the big broad strokes, saying, so for example, a pattern could be, I want to live in the country and be, as self-sufficient or resilient as possible. We want to teach these, ethics to our children. We want to, raise our family in a certain way. Those are patterns. And the details might be, okay, we're going to live in rural New Brunswick. We're going to get an old farmhouse and fix it up. We're going to get chickens. We're going to get pigs. We're going to plant an orchard. Those are details on the broader pattern. And then you can then take the pattern of how you plant that garden, or where you put the animals on the property, and you can create a pattern out of that And then you create that pattern, and then you go into the details of here's how I'm going to build the pig pen. You decide where to put the pig pen. That's part of the pattern. And then the detail is here's how I'm actually going to build the pig pen. So like there's so many different layers to this pattern to detail, but you always want to do it to the pattern to detail. I see so many different people get focused on the detail and get stuck on it and then try to create a pattern around that detail.
You can try to force the situation.
Exactly. And I'm certainly guilty of that myself.
Force things in where they don't fit. It's kind of the round peg in a square hole.
Yeah, exactly.
However that goes.
Well, you end up affecting the entire system because of this one detail you're bound to determine is going to happen. Or even if you're not stubborn about it, but you start with those details and build out from there. It's more effective to start with the broad strokes and work your way down to the details. Yeah. But like I say, there's many different layers of that.
Yep. And I think back to the chestnut trees I planted, it'd be 7 years ago now. And I had started with getting chestnut seed. And so that I went from details to pattern because I basically sprouted those, planted them in pots. And then I started looking for where I wanted to plant them. So I went about backwards and I ended up planting them in a place they didn't like. So it would have been better if I had looked at what ground I had available and went from that, analyzing it, what kind of pattern it fit into, and then went to the details, what would grow best there.
Because you might would have decided,
better result.
Chestnuts aren't what I should buy because they won't grow in these places that I have available to me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So most of them are dead now. So that's the lesson in that.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so this next one, integrate rather than segregate.
Integrate.
And no, we're not getting, all social, racial debate on you here. This is pretty practical. I can certainly see applications for it in horticulture.
Yeah, definitely that things should fit together and support each other. So like in the example I gave about manure, is it a waste stream or is it a valuable product? Well, that depends on how you handle it. Well, you see that an animal system is very valuable to a plant system when designed so that they integrate. And definitely we can see it's segregating that if the animals are like all in one state or province and we have all our pig barns in one region. And then in a different region, we've got all of our cornfields. That's segregating. So there's a lot of value comes from actually fitting these pieces together instead of trying to force them apart for a temporary benefit, because you lose more than you gain in the long run.
That's right.
You make your system fragile by segregating. You're gonna have failure is going to be more likely. You're not using all of the different aspects well. You're not using your waste streams as a useful product.
Yeah. Well, and you can even see that. I mean, you can break it down in this way as well. That is not where I want it. Or maybe that's slightly invasive, or that plant is, there's something about that plant I don't really care for. But instead of trying to get rid of it, keep it away from, you want to try to integrate its natural properties into the system you're trying to create.
I see.
That's another way of looking at it. So like, I don't think I'm not disagreeing with you, but that's just a different way of kind of in a smaller, application.
Yeah. Not saying you're going to dump all the different parts of a system in one spot because you're going to make them integrate. I mean, you probably don't want to dump your chickens inside your garden. I mean, maybe in the location next year's garden is going to be, there could be a value there. But
that's right.
So it's really recognizing relative location.
But you can integrate those chickens into your garden by running them through as pest control. So that's an integration instead of a pure segregation, of those two parts of your whole pattern.
Yeah. The quote that comes to mind here is, I think this was a Vermont farmer. Is his name Will White? He has hogs that he raises in a regenerative methods, mostly on pasture and so on. And I think someone touring the farm said, "Well, what if I don't want pigs?" And he said, "Well, you're going to have to do the pig's work then." I heard that quote. That one always struck me as
yeah, that's right.
struck me as very interesting that when you separate things, when you take something out of a system, then you often have to step in and do the function of that cog in what was an integrated ecosystem.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, same where if we're in a region where we kill off all the predators, for example, well, having removed part of the ecosystem, we basically become responsible for fulfilling the role of the predator.
Yep.
And then we have to manage accordingly.
Yep, that's right.
So for an example outside of growing, let's take this to engineering. We often hear people complain that the engineer obviously never tried to fix what they designed. So that would be an example of how the user or the maintenance technician, they're segregated too far away from the people doing the design work. And there's not enough feedback. Those need to be integrated so that systems are basically designed better.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example. All right, so number 8, I think. Anyway, use small and slow solutions. So I think this speaks mostly to don't make snap decisions, and don't make drastic changes until you have all the information, and don't maybe make even multiple changes to a problem. You want to do slow, small changes to find the solution, so that you don't overcorrect.
Yeah, I definitely see the value of smaller scale things. And again, we could look at the debate of local versus global trade, things like that. Definitely smaller scale things like a small business, for example, is more quick to adapt. I think we've talked about that with different supply chain issues where, different things that we've seen, like pigs being slaughtered uselessly due to, temporary shutdowns at a slaughter facility and so on. That was something where, since big, massive solutions have been applied and centralized, things aren't, you have more potential failure built in.
Right.
And I think this is not a definite always follow this rule. It's not like you always have to use small and slow solutions. It's just that as a general principle, they tend to succeed fairly well, particularly when you're looking for new solutions or when you aren't sure what type of feedback you're going to get. Like I mentioned, planting the chestnuts, and that would have been even worse if I'd planted 1,000 of them.
Exactly.
As far as applying that as solutions,
well, I think the concept is just don't say I have a weed in my field, so I'm going to plow the entire field.
Yeah, not being too quick to lay out the most expensive solution just because it was the first thing or the easiest that came to mind.
Right. Yeah. Make your changes slowly and methodically and specifically. Don't, my car won't start, so I'm going to change 6 different parts. And
yeah, That's
then
a good
not
example.
then not know which one was the one that actually fixed the problem, if it fixed the problem. you do one thing at a time. You change the spark plugs, or you check, change the starter, or you do it slowly and methodically, to make sure you don't have waste and all this, you could just say wasted energy, and things like that.
Yeah. I think it really is about not trying to make massive shifts
Mhm.
immediately before you understand the ramifications.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely starting smaller lets you learn and adapt. I think
hmm
that's a big part of design of any type, is being able to adapt as you go forward.
Yeah. Use and value diversity. So obviously we can think of diversity in the sense of not planting monoculture type crops, having diversity in what you're planting and how you're designing agricultural systems and horticultural systems. I think this
Yeah, I mean,
probably applies a lot broader than that, though.
I would say so. I mean, you could look at it just at the personal level. I could say diversity for me might be I have my house and my garden and planned areas under my immediate control, but then I have woods as well where I let nature kind of do its own thing and more observing. And so I value both, though, both the
Mm-hmm.
things that are highly designed and controlled and the things I'm not controlling, that nature is kind of just doing its own operations.
The thing that kind of
Um,
pops into my head is the historical small farmer.
hmm,
So
hmm,
growing cattle only is really, in a centralized way, is much more efficient because you're only doing one thing. You can optimize for that one thing. You can focus everything onto that one thing. Well, what happens when there's no market for cattle, or some disease comes through and wipes out all your cattle, right?
hmm, hmm,
Whereas the old time small farmer, he had chickens and pigs and gardens and fruits and cattle and all these different sort of diverse income streams. So if something happened and he had no egg production, well, it wasn't a huge deal because he still had all these other income streams. So he had diversity built into his system, and he was very resilient that way to, you know, things
hmm,
that happen in the world. So when I read that's the thing that popped into my head, um, of how you can utilize diversity and to
hmm,
not necessarily try to become so efficient that you centralize out diversity
hmm,
or specialize out diversity. Maybe that's the
hmm.
better word.
I think a really awesome visual example of this in the orchard setting is Miracle Farms in Quebec.
Mm.
If you look at that versus a standard orchard where you plant out one clone, it could be, I guess, Honeycrisp is one of the popular apple varieties. And so you take whatever field, it could be 20 acres, and it's all going to be just one type of plant that's all
Mm-hmm.
genetically identical. But on Miracle Farms, we see they're encouraging birds, they're encouraging wasps. They use many, many different varieties of apple. Apple trees are never even placed next to each other in order
Mm-hmm.
to help break pest cycles and make the system more resilient through diversity. So you have like an apple tree, you might have a nitrogen fixing plant. Locust, I think, is one of the ones he uses, and then a pear tree. And so apple trees are only like every third plant in the row, and then the next apple tree isn't the same variety even. So valuing diversity in
Yeah.
that, you'll have I guess, extended harvest seasons when you use diversity in that way, because some will be early, some will be late. He's stacking different plants in underneath, I believe, certain types of onions and things.
Yeah.
So I thought that was one of the best examples, and he's definitely got a lot of YouTube videos. So it's something people can look up and learn from someone diversifying a system.
The other thing I kind of thought of with this one as well was to just step away from the food production examples. And maybe it sounds wrong to say to use them, but to create diversity in your circle of associates and to value that. So everybody, if we're
You're saying all your friends aren't plumbers?
Exactly. It's that idea that if we all can grow carrots, boy, we're going to have a lot of carrots, but we might not have anything else. So we really hope we like carrots. So value the diversity that you find in society and in the circle of people that you surround yourself with. It doesn't mean that you should say, well, gee, we already got a carrot farmer, so sorry, buddy, you can't come in because you're a carrot farmer. But it's just that idea that everyone is different. Everyone brings something to the table. Everyone has different experiences and backgrounds and skills and wisdom. So many people now associate the word diversity with the color of a person's skin, their sexual orientation, their gender, like all of that stuff now, that means diversity to most people in society. But I don't think I see it as, what is a person's background? What is a person's skills? What is a person's experiences that gives them wisdom that they can bring to relationships with other people that then everyone can benefit from. So, and everyone can then use everyone else's skills and the diversity found in a group of diverse people to make all of these things that we've talked about more doable.
Yeah. Those are some good thoughts, valuing different personalities, definitely different experiences. That makes a lot of sense. So number 11, use edges and value the marginal. Now, this one may not be immediately obvious because edges is a term you see a lot in permaculture, but it may not be immediately obvious what that means to people who haven't read the resources we have. But that really comes from, I think, how Mollison observed that the edges are the most productive places in an ecosystem. So like a water edge would be an obvious example. At the edge of the water, it tends to be a zone where so many different species can flourish, whether that's amphibians or a variety of plants that like being just on the edge of the water, and so on. If we look at the fence lines in fields, those tend to have some of the healthiest soil due to not being tilled and having all the organic matter carbon oxidized away. They are also very diverse. They're packing a ton of different species in there usually. So it's interesting to see how edges of zones can be productive. Do you have any other examples?
No, that was going to be my examples. What we call tree lines around here, which are basically lines of trees that separate, fields, and traditionally around here often would have had, cedar rail fences, things of that nature. There's entire ecosystems in this, 10 or 15 or 20 foot wide strip of, single line of trees with some bushes growing up in them. There's entire ecosystems in there. Old apple trees and cranberry bushes and partridge or grouse, I guess they are. And, birds and insects and snakes, and like everything is in that, and they're incredibly productive. We might not look at it as productive because, well, I'm not going to necessarily eat those things or utilize them. But if we take that concept and the things we observe in nature and then apply that to our cultivated ecosystems, we can replicate the same thing and take advantage of those principles in creating edge and planting on those edge and encouraging life on those edges to then give us, a yield off of that, instead of just saying we're going to clear all this out and put in 100 acres of soybeans.
Yeah. I mean, we see the recognition of the value of edge in how there's so much encouragement of planting. They call them shelter belts out west on the prairies, I think, primarily. But how they've gone back to planting more trees to provide some resistance to the wind. It slows down wind erosion, provides some value like that. But look, if you go and look at the edge of a field, for example, you'll see that the forest is thickest right at the edge of the field.
Yep.
And it can often be a sweet spot where it has a lot of moisture there because of the woods, but it also has the most light because it's not totally overshadowed.
That's right.
And it tends to be where you see the most number of individual species. Like if you go into woods and it has a heavy overstory, there's not many species thrive underneath that.
Yep.
But on the edge, there tends to be a lot. So basically, applying this to the design element, it's that if edges are valuable, design them in. So I've seen things like what they call alley cropping, which is you plant trees in lines at intervals on a field, and then you can crop in between them, but the trees are growing and they'll eventually be a valuable crop later on down the road. It's also providing some edge benefits. For example, if you ran livestock in there, there would be some shade. Plants like trees tend to protect land from drying out as quickly. Things like that. With pond design, rather than making a pond a perfect circle, design it so it has a wavy edge, basically, as much edge as you can. And it can be more productive. You'll see more and a greater variety of plants and animals use that pond because it has so much edge space.
Yep, absolutely. So the final one here is creatively use and respond to change. And I think this one is in many ways a challenge to people. So I think this is very much a challenge to think outside the box. When something doesn't go exactly the way you thought it was going to go on your property, or it's almost when life hands you lemons kind of concept. Maybe you don't make lemonade. Maybe you get creative and you make lemon dolls. I don't know, but you do something and you think outside the box and how to turn that into something of benefit, instead of just saying, well, my chickens died, so I guess that's it for chickens. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess changing seasons would be one thing as well. Instead of just being like, oh, winter's coming. It's like, well, creatively use the winter season, whether that's having more time available to do the design work finally, or making the most you can out of the recreation available through like skating or sliding, skiing. Up north where we have so much snow. And thinking of ways to use those things. Definitely, life changes. For you, I guess responding to growing family means you have more hands you can apply to the work. it probably helps now when it comes to things like chicken processing.
That's right. Yep. Yeah, this isn't just, this applies to all kinds of different change. And this is a pretty broad principle that really, I think people can get the concept of how to apply. It's pretty straightforward. So we're going to put this PDF that these principles come from and what everything we've talked about sort of is based on. That'll be in the show notes. And then there's also another link here of useful permaculture principle, permaculture principles that people might find useful. So we'll put those links in the show notes, so you can, if you want to go read that, you can. So I think this is last minute, but I think we're going to skip the news. We've gone on almost an hour and a half, so I'm thinking maybe we'll skip the news this week and just go right ahead and thank everybody for listening. And if you have listener feedback you'd like to send us, changingnormal@protonmail.com is the email that you can send it to, or you can post on any of our social media to let us know what you think. And maybe if you have topic suggestions or questions or want further explanation on any of the things we talked about, please go and like and share and subscribe. You sharing with your friends, honestly, is the best way for us to get our podcast out there and get our thoughts and opinions into people's ears. That sounds really terrible, but that's what we want to do. So go ahead and share us with all your friends. We're on YouTube and Twitter. Go check us out on Fountain. Fountain is .fm, and that is an app where you can listen to our show, listen to all your favorite podcasts, and get paid in Bitcoin for doing so. So that's pretty cool. Donations specifically can be sent to us if you want to donate to the show. Changing Normal at fountain.fm. That's a Lightning URL. Or you can just, there's a function inside of fountain.fm where you can sort of, I guess it's almost like a tipping kind of thing. I forget exactly.
I haven't tried it yet, so that's on my to-do list.
Yeah, I haven't explored it too much, but it seems like a pretty neat concept. The app is fairly new. It's only maybe 6 months. I'm not sure, but
yep, I've heard people say it's got some bugs to be worked out.
Some bugs, but yeah,
I love applying the value for value concept. Trying to make that more accessible.
That's right. All right. So with that, thanks so much for listening. And remember, create your own new normal every day.